The brass plaque outside Aurelia didn't announce itself so much as it gleamed at you, the way old money smiles with closed lips. If you didn't know to look for it, you'd walk past the charcoal-painted door and the potted myrtles, trimmed into spheres precise as carriage clocks. Inside, the air kept secrets. It smelled faintly of beeswax and white truffle, with a shy thread of lemon oil rising off the mahogany, as if the wood itself were exhaling after a long, dignified life. Crystal made its quiet chiming when a sleeve brushed a glass. Silver whispered against porcelain. Nothing clattered. Even the laughter wore gloves. That was the kingdom Hannah Sterling liked to rule. She arrived without arriving. No commotion, only the hush that moved across the dining room like a northern wind. The black Bentley drifted to the curb. A driver in a cap opened the door before she decided to be assisted. She unfolded from the back seat, slim as a fencing blade, her coat the color of a thunderhead, and cut with a line that could have sheared marble. Her face, 30 years of money, 5 of mercy, wore that careful stillness only surgeons and socialites can purchase. But her eyes, winter sky pale, took inventory. A water ring not wiped to extinction. A waiter whose shoes had remembered yesterday. A rose that had blossomed past its command. She harvested flaws for sport and carried them home like game. She didn't need to raise her voice. A slight bristle of displeasure along her jaw could make a man sell his cufflinks and apologize to the cufflinks for having to go. The staff said she could hear a souffle fall from 3 rooms away and knew what temperature the martini glass had been chilled to by the sorrow in the ice. It was local religion, and the devout observed. Mr. Dubois, Aurelia's manager, cultivated a manner like a button waistcoat 1 size too small. He smoothed his tie the way castaways check the horizon and tipped his smile onto the floor if Hannah appeared within 10 yards. He had developed for her table a choreography as precise as astronomy. The light over the corner banquette, her corner, was softened by a gauze filter hidden in the coffer. The banquette's leather, a deeper ox blood than the others, was polished with something the color of patience. Her glass was always unclouded. Her bread plate lived at 5 o'clock, her knife at 1/2 past. A white gardenia, no blemish, no bruise, floated in a baccarat bowl as if the flower feared to sink without permission. Robert Sterling accompanied her often, a building made into a man, thick-shouldered and accommodating only to gravity. He had the look of someone who had never met a wall he didn't wish to purchase. He let his wife do the exacting. His business was the wrecking ball that arrived later with a bouquet. Into this climate, soft lighting, hard money, stepped a new waitress who, through the stupidity of bills and the treachery of tuition, had taken a job in a room where people used adjectives to order water. Her name was Calista Martinez, and she entered by the service door. Every morning she tied her hair up as if cinching down a thought that might otherwise fly, pressed her black shirt crisp as a decision, and slipped a tiny sparrow pin onto her lapel, a silver bird with outstretched wings that no one but she had to notice. Callista's hands knew charcoal dust and clay slumps from Pratt Institute. They were good hands, careful, curious, steady in the way that remembers a line when a professor says, again. She had taken the job at Aurelia because numbers have a way of pecking holes in your sleep, and tips here were rumored to plug them. Between studio fees, a father's bookstore that had died of progress, and a city where rent had teeth, she needed the kind of money that sat at tables and didn't blink when caviar was introduced like an old friend. Orientation at Aurelia sounded like preparing for a spacewalk. Mr. Dubois stood before the new staff and spoke of trajectory and vacuum and the importance of not dying. Her water, he said, pinching the stem of an imaginary glass, must never fall below half. Not 3/8, not 5/16. The glass is to be rotated so the seam faces away. The napkin is placed with the fold toward the plate, not toward destiny. And her martini, here, a respectful pause. Her martini must be a prayer. She's just a customer, Callista said, a little more naive than she meant to sound, a little more brave. Miss Martinez, Mr. Dubois replied, the way one addresses fog. She is a climate. Most nights Callista shadowed Samuel, a senior waiter whose hair had faded into gentleness and whose hands, though elegant, had developed a tremor that came and went, like weather. Samuel moved through the dining room the way some men move through libraries, reading the quiet, careful with the spines. He could lay a fork so true you'd swear it had always belonged to that inch. He taught her the private maps. Table 9 will ask for a spoon that does not shine. Table 13 pretends to share. Table 6 has a shellfish allergy and a mistress. He showed her how to listen to the clink and the hush, how to time the plate's landing with the punchline of a laugh, how to be present without appearing to exist, which is a little like painting light on water and asking it to hold still. The first night Hannah came while Callista stood close enough to see the stitching on the woman's gloves. The room did what rooms do, change shape around a person certain she owned the shape. Hannah's coat slid from her shoulders like a secret leaving. She reached the corner banquette without appearing to walk. Callista felt her pulse in her throat, one of those country drums that no one has practiced, and carried menus that weighed more than the fact of paper. "Good evening, Mr. and Mrs. Sterling," she said, setting down the leather-bound volumes under the gentle cone of light. Her voice, trained on critiques and apologies, found the pitch of polite. Hannah didn't look at the menu. She looked at Callista. If an icicle were a gaze, it would have been this one. "You are new," she said, not as accusation so much as a verdict delivered after a trial no one attended. "Yes, Mrs. Sterling," Callista answered. 3 weeks. 3 weeks is not a unit of time, I recognize, Hannah said, and with that folded the evening into its proper shape. "I will have a Vesper Martini, Nolets Silver, Lillet Blanc, a whisper of Stolichnaya Elite, a peel of Amalfi lemon expressed over the glass, but not abandoned in it. The glass must be chilled to exactly 3 degrees Celsius, not 4, not a poet's idea of 3. She let a beat pass. "I trust you can remember that." "I can," Callista said, catching the proportions the way her hand catches light. "Nolets Silver, Lillet Blanc, a whisper of Elite, lemon expressed but not left, glass at 3 degrees. "Macallan 18, Robert added without looking, as if speaking from a dream in which he reliably owned everything. In the bar's shadow, Frank, who had shaken more cocktails than some people have shaken hands, eyed her with one eye closed. "The Nolets prescription," he murmured. "The Queen's quiz. Want me to take the glass's temperature with my little ray gun? Or does faith heal?" "Use the gun," Callista said. "And Frank, if a whisper of vodka is a unit of sound, make it one heard only by people who see ghosts." He smiled and obliged. The martini arrived with the glass frosted like a window in a storybook about winter, the Macallan throwing amber at the light, the lemon peel disciplined into a ribbon of good upbringing. Callista placed them and stepped back one regulation pace. Hannah lifted her eyes to the ceiling. one of those ceilings painted to remember the night, and narrowed slightly. "The light over this table," she said, swinging a little finger. "It is wrong." Mr. Dubois from across the room tensed as if someone had pulled his string. Callista looked up into the coffered recess and knew the dimmer setting by heart. She had watched the assistant manager tap it in with a reverence bordering on prayer. The light wasn't wrong. It was indifferent. It threw a thin line under Hannah's cheekbone, too honest a line for the sort of evening where truth should always be amber and forgiving. "Of course," Callista said, and did not summon a ladder or a man or the Almighty. She struck a match. The candle on Hannah's table woke, a small sun. She slid the gardenia bowl 3/4 of an inch and tilted the blossom so the candle struck white petal, then bounced to the jaw in a soft spill. The harsh line softened. The face in the light unclenched by a fraction. Light, obeyed, is an easy dog. Hannah watched her as if measuring an unadvertised quality. She took in the candle, the flower, the softening, and then lifted the martini with 2 fingers and a lecture. "Adequate," she said, which in a friendlier kingdom might have been called a blessing. Robert watched the exchange and smiled to himself. His smile said, "I like to see a bridge hold." All night, small Tess fell like sleet. The chilled pea soup had to be cold as regret. The asparagus could not so much as meet steam in an unchaperoned way. The server must anticipate the absence of condiments no one would touch. Callista bent her attention toward these commandments with the same focus she used in studio when charcoal needed to become cheekbone and cheekbone needed to tell a story. She carried plates that were warmer than compliments. She removed plates that died beautifully. She learned how to move so the room forgot to be disturbed. In the safety of the corridor outside the kitchen, where garlic rode the air like a bold friend, and the dishwashers sang in Spanish about girls no one here could afford to love, Samuel steadied his tray on a hip and gave her a look like an old hymn. "She asked you to fix the light," he said. "You fixed it." "I moved a flower," Callista answered, untying and tying again her apron as if it were a puzzle. "You moved her face," Samuel said. "That's the more dangerous renovation." On her way back to the dining room, Callista passed a framed photo behind the host stand. A young Robert Sterling leaning against a steel beam, helmet crooked, grin wide, the city behind him giddy with cranes. The caption named a tower she knew too well, a tower that had risen where her father's bookstore once kept weather and words away. The page and lantern had smelled of oiled wood and paper and raincoats drying. The daymen came with rolled blueprints and polite voices. Her father had smiled the way a man smiles at a storm and moved the armchair to the middle of the floor as if dignity liked a view. He died a year after he sold the keys. The world called it a heart attack. She called it a skyscraper. So when she turned back to the corner banquette carrying the amuse-bouches arranged like a series of gentle decisions, she didn't see only a powerful couple holding court. She saw an architect of absence and the person who made absence look fashionable. 2 nights later, Hannah arrived in a mood you could catch a chill from. The Bentley door closed and a sliver of cold slipped under Aurelia's threshold. She wore a dress the exact black of a piano's good intentions and diamonds that blinked like stars if stars could sneer. Callista brought menus, water, the orchestra of bread. Samuel watched from his section like a man on a dock reading a storm. "Your pin," Hannah said, before the water had learned to bead. She pointed her gaze more than her finger. "That little bird." It is frivolous. Callista's hand went to it by reflex. Small sparrow, bright against black cloth. The pin had flown through her childhood on the lapel of her mother's coat, then slept in a drawer after the funeral until Callista had said one morning, almost aloud, "Come on," and brought it to work. "It has sentimental value," she said, which was another way of saying, "It is the only jewel I can afford that keeps time." "Sentiment," Hannah replied, not cruel, simply bored, "is for private rooms." "Remove it." Callista unclasped the sparrow slowly, the way one undoes a necklace from a sleeping child. She slid it into her apron pocket where tips hoped to live. If she felt the small puncture of loss as the pin's needle left the fabric, she did not bleed where anyone could see. After the sea base, pan-seared, 2 times 45 seconds, edges crisp, heart tender. Hannah beckoned her with a curve of index finger. "I believe I may have dropped an earring," she said. "Be a dear." Her voice held sugarcane and steel. Callista looked down. The carpet had the confidence to be cream. Nothing glinted. She lifted her eyes to Hannah's ear. 2 stones secure as grudges. The request was not a request. It wasn't even a test. It was theater, and the part offered to Callista was girl on floor. "I will gladly search," Callista said, pitching her voice lower so the rest of the table couldn't fish the words from the air. "But at this moment, you are wearing both earrings. If I kneel now, people might think you are—" She let the sentence choose the gentlest cliff to stop at, "forgetful." Hannah's eyelashes rested on the thought. For a fraction of a second, the smooth mask took on hairline cracks. Then she laughed softly, like a bell rung by a woman with small fingers. "You are right," she said. "How silly of me." She turned to her friends and arranged the moment into something pretty. "Yesterday's earrings," she said. "I'm conflating." When Callista stepped away, her legs ticked like metronomes. In the alley-side corridor, she leaned for a breath against a cool wall and counted to 8 the way a studio chair had taught her to do when a line wobbled and a professor was near. The wall smelled of lemon oil laid down by a tired man who would never eat here. Samuel found her and gave her a napkin, which is to say, permission to take her time. "Don't win in public," Samuel murmured. "She can forgive being right. She cannot forgive being seen to be wrong." "What should I have done?" Callista asked, folding the napkin until it looked like discipline. "Crawl?" "Sometimes," Samuel said, and looked ashamed of the thought. The next week arrived, like a cat that pretends to be stray. Hannah came twice, then skipped a beat, then once more. Her attention turned to Callista the way frost turns on windows, filigree spreading. She asked for the oil, tasted it, and announced it Ligurian when the menu said Tuscan and Callista, because her job had been to soothe 1,000 little pains, went back to the kitchen, found the tin, and returned with truth kindly altered. "Our house oil is Ligurian, Mrs. Sterling, but the chef finished this plate with a Tuscan blend for its peppery note. He's flattered you identified it." The chef raised a ladle at her in faint outrage. Callista raised a look at him that said, "I'm painting a wolf. Be the tree." Between services, the restaurant exhaled. The chandeliers dimmed to the exact melancholy of after midnight. The last cappuccino left a cocoa thumbprint on foam. Callista, released from the floor, sat on an overturned milk crate in the storage hallway, next to neat sacks of flour that smelled like better days. She took the sparrow pin from her apron pocket and rolled it between thumb and forefinger, the metal warm and stubborn. The bird's wings caught the weak light and bent it into bravery. She thought of her mother stepping out into winter with this same little bird riding the black of her coat like a promise. She thought of a hand on a bookshop door, a bell chiming once, and a man's voice from behind the counter saying, "Back again?" Good. The ache behind her breastbone lifted its head, stretched, lay down again. She repinned the sparrow. If sentiment was for private rooms, let this corridor be private enough. Around the corner, the staff bathroom's fan hummed with the insistence of old machinery. On a shelf under the office fax machine, an open ledger lay face down like a sleeping fish. Mr. Dubois was off duty. Someone had smuggled in a box of cheap cookies and left half a row as a gift to the gods of hospitality. A busser snored in a chair and dreamed, by the look of his smile, about a girl who laughed too loudly and didn't care. When Callista came back to the dining room, a certain table had tilting energy, the kind of tilt you feel in a boat when the wind decides to remember its purpose. Hannah sat with two women lacquered into their 30s, bracelets like chains on summer dresses. The conversation was about original things in a city that often forgot what that word was for. As Callista refilled water, she caught a sentence. "Robert cannot possibly be serious," one woman murmured. "Not after—" And then Hannah's eyes flicked up like a blade and cut the sentence in half. The hush that followed wasn't ordinary hush. It was the kind that has a body. 2 days after that, Hannah didn't come. Samuel, restocking Burgundy in the cellar, told a story without looking at her. When they first started, she was a shadow, he said, settling a bottle into a cradle as carefully as if he were laying a child to sleep. He, Robert, filled the room with his noise. She sat and learned the vocabulary. He slid another bottle in. And then, 1 year after the tower, they traded places. He settled. She sharpened the tower, Callista said, and the word felt like a stone in her mouth. Samuel nodded. Sterling Tower. He bought the sky and the lot beneath it. Not the first man to do so, not the last. The city applauded. The city grieved. Depends where you were standing. Callista knew exactly where she had been standing. Behind the counter at the Page and Lantern, arranging a stack of paperbacks the landlord's son had called dead inventory, while her father joked about poets with good teeth. Men in suits had come with a smell like new carpet and a smile like wet paint. They had used words that meant the same thing as loss, but didn't sound like it. They had left a brochure of a building made of glass doing violence to the sky. She had watched her father pick up the brochure, hold it at arm's length, and say mildly, "Who needs that much reflection?" In her apartment, late, the city's sleep hissed along radiator pipes, and the window caught a triangle of someone else's blue television. She turned on her laptop, that barge carrying all the world's rumors, and typed Hannah's name into the search box as if inviting a ghost. Pages offered themselves, galas and gowns, charities like hats. She found little older than the tower. It was as if before that she had been a rumor even in her own home. An old gala program, buried in a PDF graveyard, yielded a maiden name, Gallo. She typed again, Hannah Gallo, and the internet, surprised to be useful, coughed up a clipping as yellowed as if it had been kept under a refrigerator magnet in a kitchen with linoleum floors. A local New Jersey paper, 20 years distant, reported a bribery case, zoning permits greased with envelopes. A developer eager to grow a seed of ambition into a stalk that could pierce the clouds. A junior accountant at the construction firm had provided ledgers and backbone. The article called her a credible witness. 2 weeks later, another clipping, smaller. Witness recanted. Case collapsed. The junior accountant's name was Hannah Gallo. The developer's name was not yet famous. 2 years later, it would be. Callista leaned back in her chair. The radiator clanged like a pan dropped in a far kitchen. Outside, a truck sighed. A city thing trying to remember how to sleep. She closed her eyes and saw, superimposed on the dark, a young woman twisting a napkin the way nerves twist logic. She saw a ledger closed with 2 hands that would later wear diamonds. She saw a life built like a tower. Steel, glass, and 3 inches of guilt poured between each floor. Her stomach lifted and fell. She wasn't the law. She wasn't a crusader. She was a waitress with an artist's eye, and a father who had leaned into a storm until it took him. She pressed her thumbs against her eyelids until fireworks paired with black. Hannah's power had always seemed the sort you couldn't touch, because it wasn't earnest. It was vapor, fear arranged into a crown. But vapor has a source, and source has a pipe, and sometimes pipes leak. Back in the restaurant's light, days later, Mr. Dubois called a quick meeting between seatings with the urgency of a man whose tie was forgetting how to be straight. The Starlight Gala, he announced, Aurelia will host again this year. Children's Hospital. Press God. Everything must be to the atom. He glanced at a paper that trembled in his hand. Mrs. Sterling will chair. She has requested, he swallowed. She has requested that Miss Martinez serve the head table. The room went briefly still. Someone's tray tilted and righted itself. A dishwasher grinned, and then didn't. Samuel looked at Callista the way one looks at a daughter driving away. Congratulations, Mr. Dubois said, which meant, God help you. Callista smoothed her apron and felt in her pocket. The little sparrow. The pin warmed under her thumb. Fear sat down beside her, familiar, one knee crossed over the other. But something else came too. Something that had not visited since she'd drawn the outline of a face and known the expression before the charcoal touched paper. It wasn't vengeance. It was clarity, with its sleeves rolled up. She went to the hostess stand and straightened the stack of menus as if aligning her thoughts by inches. Then, in a place where nobody could see, she touched the pin to her lip, a small, unadvertised oath. Be invisible, Samuel whispered as the team dispersed. No, she said softly, and she wasn't sure whether she was correcting him or informing herself. Be exact, the day of the gala, Aurelia put on a costume it already owned. White orchids descended the banister like a spill of moonlight. Strings sang the sort of songs that cost extra. The light remembered every beautiful lie it had ever told. Cameras, each with its own appetite, lurked respectfully, the way tigers might if tigers had badges. The head table wore silver like ice. Guests arrived in gowns that had required committees, cufflinks that had traveled with bodyguards, and smiles that might last the night, if not the marriage. Hannah entered wrapped in a silver dress that made the room take a breath. Around her neck, the sterling diamond, a shard of star cut into obedience, caught every photon the chandeliers could spare and multiplied them into faith. Robert walked at her side, a mountain with a good tailor. Hannah's hand rested on his sleeve the way a queen's hand rests on the shoulder of a throne, as if to reassure it that it could be replaced. Callista's tray had an arrangement of amuse-bouches that would have looked at home in a diorama about abundance. Her shoes were polished. The sparrow stayed in her pocket. She felt, more than heard, the room, A hum under the music, a many-throated creature trying to remember which mouth to use for appetite and which for conversation. She moved in the hum the way a fish moves through current, doesn't fight it, doesn't let it decide the route. Hannah's table accepted course after course as if accepting tribute from provinces. The diamond sat and blazed. Callista poured water, poured wine, removed plates that had fulfilled destinies, answered requests for salt by providing the idea of salt without making any of it granular. Her hands did the work, and somewhere behind her ribs, a colder set of hands sorted cards and laid them down in an order that would, later, look inevitable. When the main course left the table, lamb pinker than flirtation, carrots resigned to excellence, Hannah lifted a hand and let a fragile gasp leave her. The room obeyed, paws falling like a veil. "My necklace," she said, almost tenderly, and fingers rose to her bare throat where a minute earlier light had been very sure of itself. Robert stood, turning anger on like a light in a room that didn't need it. "What is this?" he began, and then stopped because the cameras were already aim. Hannah turned her face toward Callista, who held a stack of plates as if holding an argument. "You were here," Hannah said, voice pitched so the room could be audience. "You bumped my chair." Her eyes said, "You will kneel now and decorate my story." Callista set the plates on a side stand one by one, the clink so quiet it counted as prayer. She straightened. She felt the sparrow pin in her pocket, point and wing. The orchids gave off a ghost of scent. Somewhere a violin negotiated with a note. She looked not at Hannah but at Robert Sterling, as a child sometimes looks past the mother to the father when asking permission to be true. "The page and lantern," she said, voice even, carrying without shoving, "was a bookstore on 9th and Alder. Does the name trouble your memory?" The sentence did what the best artists do. It changed the light without changing the bulb. Faces in the near rows turned. Robert's first glance, the one he didn't edit, flickered. The next one, a man's trained denial, hardened. "We are speaking of a theft," he said, "not of nostalgia." "We are speaking of foundations," Callista answered, and then turned back to Hannah, and saw, behind the diamondless throat and the steel mouth, a younger woman twisting a napkin, ledger ink on her fingers. "Some things are lost," she said, "and some are stolen. And some are traded for a very long life in a very bright room. The air had the quality of snow right before it decides to start." Somewhere out of sight, Mr. Dubois whispered a prayer that sounded suspiciously like Callista's name. The first flash went off without a shutter click. There is a kind of light that comes only from attention. Hannah's eyes, pale and practiced, made a small miscalculation and let fear through. Callista kept her hands visible, palm against palm, one thumb laid across the other like a quiet cross. She had no plan to be grand. She had only the truth arranged in an order that did not require apology. She had likewise, and painfully, learned how to wait. The day after the gala announcement, Aurelia smelled faintly of polish and worry. Mr. Dubois' tie had given up entirely and hung like a tired flag. He barked at busboys, polished non-existent spots from crystal, and whispered so fervently to the chef that you'd think they were planning a coup. Everyone knew the gala was no ordinary night. For Mrs. Sterling, it was coronation stage and battlefield rolled into one. Callista moved quietly through the dining room, her hands stacked with folded napkins, each crease sharp enough to draw blood. She practiced her steps between tables like brushstrokes, slow and exact, a rehearsal no one applauded. Her reflection ghosted across the mirror paneling, an ordinary girl in black and white. But in her pocket, the little sparrow pin pressed warm against her palm. Samuel found her by the service station, polishing cutlery with the kind of care reserved for confessionals. His eyes, tired but watchful, scanned her face. "You understand what she's doing, don't you?" His voice was soft, like the underside of worn velvet. Callista nodded. "She's not rewarding me. She's inviting me into the spotlight. She's baiting the trap," Samuel corrected. "And when it springs, everyone in this city's going to hear the snap." He set down a knife, the silver catching the lamplight, thin and accusing. "I don't say this lightly. Be ready to lose." It may be the only way to survive her. Callista smoothed another napkin, each fold a way of telling herself she would not bend. "I've lost enough, she said. The words came out like truth carved into wood. The week marched on with the kind of manic precision only New York knows before a spectacle. Trucks rolled up with crates of orchids. Electricians ran cords through Aurelia's veins. The chandeliers were lowered and dressed in twinkling lights that made the room look like a jewelry box cracked open. Staff rehearsed their routes with the fervor of soldiers drilling for a war none of them had volunteered for. Callista watched, listening to the orchestra of orders and sighs. Her part in the play was clear. Serve the head table, serve Mrs. Sterling. Every eye would be watching her tray, her step, her smile. She would not be invisible, nor would she cower. In her apartment, the city's noise humming outside the window. She returned to her research. She combed through archives until her eyes stung, chasing the ghost of Hannah Gallo across headlines and footnotes. Each discovery was a stitch. The recanted testimony, the sudden marriage, the meteoric rise of Robert Sterling, and stitched among them her father's death, the bookstore's eviction, her mother's grief. The quilt was ugly, but it was whole. Callista whispered the names into her dark room, as if practicing lines. Hannah Gallo, Robert Sterling, Page and Lantern. Saying them out loud gave them weight, a kind of gravity she could hold on to. The night of the Starlight Gala arrived, like a storm that had sent invitations weeks in advance. Black cars lined the street, their exhaust curling like incense. Paparazzi cameras fired in nervous bursts as gowns shimmered past. Sequins, satin, silk. The red carpet outside Aurelia pulsed with wealth, politicians smiling too wide, celebrities wrapped in diamonds that could ransom a country. Inside, Aurelia was transformed. White orchids spilled from vases like frozen waterfalls. Tiny lights strung across the ceiling glittered like stars trapped indoors. The air was thick with perfume and anticipation. Every table gleamed under its assigned constellation of chandeliers, but none more than the head table, a stretch of silver and crystal worthy of a queen. Callista tied her apron, the special black silk version issued for the event. She tucked the sparrow pin into her pocket, hidden but present, a secret ally. Her hands were steady, though her stomach rippled like a pond struck by stones. Samuel squeezed her shoulder before she walked out. "Remember," he said, "she's playing a game. That doesn't mean you have to play by her rules." Callista nodded, though her throat felt tight. When Hannah Sterling entered, the room inhaled as one. She wore a silver gown that clung like ice and scattered light in every direction. Around her throat blazed the sterling diamond, 50 carats of fire suspended from platinum. The cameras flashed so often it seemed daylight had returned, if only to see her shine. Robert walked at her side, mountain steady, the amused smile of a man certain the city, bent to his will. They took their seats at the head table, and Callista approached with the first tray of amuse-bouches, tiny towers of foie gras and fig, arranged as if architecture had been persuaded to become edible. "Miss Martinez," Hannah said when Callista placed the first plate. The name was sharp, as though Hannah had plucked it from the air and bent it into a weapon. "Do not disappoint me." "I won't, Mrs. Sterling," Callista replied. Her voice was calm, her hands precise. The courses unfolded with orchestral timing. Wine poured like velvet. Plates appeared and vanished with seamless grace. Hannah smiled occasionally, the kind of smile that carried no warmth but plenty of warning. Callista performed each task with quiet determination, her body a mask, her thoughts a gathering storm. Then, as the main course was cleared, lamb delicate as silk, asparagus resigned to perfection, Hannah gasped, sharp and theatrical. Her hand flew to her throat. "My necklace," she cried, her voice pitched perfectly to slice through the chatter. "It's gone." The room froze. Robert lurched to his feet, fury already simmering on his face. Guests twisted in their chairs. Cameras swiveled like rifles locking on a target. Hannah turned, her pale eyes finding Callista. The young waitress stood still, plates balanced in her arms. "You," Hannah said, her voice trembling with righteous outrage. "You were here. You brushed against me." Callista felt every gaze sear into her. The trap had sprung, teeth bared. Mr. Dubois appeared at her elbow, sweating, whispering frantically. "Come with me, Miss Martinez. We'll sort this out quietly." But Callista didn't move. She placed the plates gently on a side station and straightened, her back a line of resolve. "You're right, Mrs. Sterling," she said, her voice clear and calm, echoing through the hushed room. "I was here. I was close. But perhaps you're mistaken about where your necklace has gone." Gas fluttered around the table. Hannah's eyes widened, her mask threatening to crack. Robert's face darkened, thunderclouds gathering. Callista took a breath, steady as a painter about to set the first stroke on canvas. "I'd like to tell you about a bookstore," she said. "It was called The Page and Lantern." And the air in Aurelia shifted, heavy with the promise of revelation. Callista's voice was not raised, yet it filled the air like smoke curling through a closed room. The name she spoke, The Page and Lantern, slipped from her mouth with the quiet weight of a gravestone. It was a bookstore no one at the table had ever heard of. But the moment she said it, Robert Sterling flinched as if someone had whispered his true name in church. Guests leaned closer, forks stilled over half-eaten lamb. The charity donors, senators, hedge fund barons, and magazine darlings who had come to drink champagne and write checks suddenly realized they were witnessing something far more entertaining than philanthropy. Robert cleared his throat. "This is absurd," he barked. "We're talking about a $50 million necklace, not fairy tales." His voice was thunder, meant to frighten. But Callista had lived in storms before. She had studied the clouds of eviction notices, the lightning of debt, the rainfall of grief. Thunder was only noise. "The Page and Lantern," she said again, slower this time, her eyes locked on his. "It was a bookstore. My father's bookstore. It stood on the block where you built Sterling Tower." The words struck like stones against glass. Across the table, Hannah's lips pressed together, her silver mask faltering. Her diamond earrings quivered in the candlelight, betraying the tremor beneath her skin. Callista inhaled deeply, the orchid's perfume suddenly suffocating. Her heart was racing, but she wrapped her voice in calm. "You didn't just buy the land. You destroyed a community. My father poured his life into that store. It wasn't just shelves and paper. It was neighbors, stories, a place where people felt seen. And when you forced him out, you didn't just take away a business, you broke a man's heart. 1 year later, it killed him, gasps whispered across the tablecloth. A senator shifted uncomfortably. A fashion mogul tapped his champagne flute but thought better of it. Robert's jaw tightened. This is slander. Security. No, Callista cut in, her voice slicing through his order. She turned, her gaze landing on Hannah, the woman cloaked in silver fire. And you, Mrs. Sterling, you know better than anyone how this empire began. Don't you? The room seemed to tilt. Hannah's hands tightened on her napkin, knuckles whitening. She tried to laugh, brittle as broken glass. She's raving. She's trying to cover her theft with melodrama. But Callista was not finished. She stepped closer to the head table, candlelight flickering across her face. I read about a young accountant once, Hannah Gallo, before she became Mrs. Sterling, a witness in a bribery case against a city official. She had the ledgers, she had the truth. And then, Callista let the pause breathe, her eyes never leaving Hannah's. She recanted. She said she'd been mistaken. The case collapsed. The permits were granted, and Robert Sterling's kingdom began a silence heavier. Then velvet descended. You could hear the ice in glasses melting. Cameras from the far end of the room zoomed in, hungry for the kill. Hannah's mask cracked. Her lips parted, but no words arrived. The girl she had buried decades ago, the nervous accountant clutching a ledger, stood exposed in her eyes. Callista's chest burned, her breath tight, but she pressed on. So tonight you accuse me of stealing your necklace. But tell me, Mrs. Sterling, who really stole something priceless? Because I lost my father. My family lost our future. And you stole your soul. The last word landed like a hammer blow. The air inside Aurelia curdled. Guess who had once bowed to Hannah's slightest nod now leaned back, uneasy, as if afraid the venom might spray their way. Robert's face darkened to the shade of raw iron, but even he felt the tremor of recognition. He knew there was truth in the girl's voice, and truth was always more dangerous than lies in rooms filled with money. Callista didn't tremble. Her knees wanted to buckle, but she locked them straight and lifted her chin. She had been told all her life to be small, invisible, apologetic. Tonight, under chandeliers dripping with light like molten pearls, she was larger than both Sterlings combined. Security, Robert said again, this time lower, less thunder and more growl. But no one moved. Not the waiters, not the busboys, not even Mr. Dubois, whose hands clutched his tie like a rosary. The whole room was spellbound, trapped in the web of a waitress and her truth. Callista broke the stillness with a scalpel of a smile. Do you know what dignity looks like, Mrs. Sterling? It isn't a necklace. It isn't a corner booth. It isn't fear dressed in couture. Dignity is what you can't take from a girl on a student loan, even when you strip her family of everything else. Hannah's hand shot to her throat. Reflex. Instinct. The gesture of a woman guarding not just the necklace, but the very illusion of who she was. Fingers brushed the hidden clasp, and in that small, damning movement, the lie detonated. The necklace had never been lost. A gasp cut through the crowd like a blade. Someone dropped a fork. A single paparazzo's flash exploded, searing the moment into permanence. Hannah's eyes darted left, then right, like a trapped animal. For the first time, the Queen of Aurelia looked pitiful. Callista's gaze slid, slow as molasses, toward Arthur Vance, The rival perched 2 seats down, his tuxedo crisp, his smirk carved from spite. "And as for your necklace, Mrs. Sterling," Callista tilted her head, "perhaps you should ask your husband's good friend Arthur why he brought along a replica in his pocket tonight." Every head snapped toward Vance. The man froze, wineglass halfway to his lips. His silence was confession enough. It was carnage, but Callista kept her tone almost gentle, the way one might scold a misbehaving child. "You wanted a spectacle, Mrs. Sterling. You staged a theft to humiliate me. But look around. Who is humiliated now?" Hannah's breath came ragged, her shoulders rising and falling as if she were drowning in her own gown. Her eyes, those wintry blue blades that once cut staff to ribbons, were wide, wet, human. A mask shattered in real time. Robert Sterling stood, the tablecloth tugging with his knees. For years, people had feared the shadow he cast. Tonight, his shadow shrank. He looked at his wife, not with loyalty, not even with anger, just with cold arithmetic. She was no longer an asset. She was a liability. He gave the smallest shake of his head, a gesture of dismissal, a man cutting off a gangrenous limb. Hannah's lips parted. "Robert!" The plea cracked, raw, unpolished. For the first time in decades, her voice belonged not to a queen, but to Hannah Gallo, the terrified girl from New Jersey. But Robert had already turned away. His security detail closed ranks around him as he strode toward the exit, the thunder of his footsteps echoing against marble and silence. Arthur Vance chuckled into his drink. The predators were already circling, ready to feast on the carcass of Sterling's empire. Hannah remained standing alone, the necklace still clutched at her throat, her eyes darting to Callista. And in that gaze was hatred, yes, but deeper still, a recognition. "You saw me. You pulled the curtain. You ruined the trick." Callista met her eyes with something more cutting than hatred. Pity. Because Hannah had built a life of marble and diamonds atop a foundation of sand, and all it had taken was one waitress with steady hands to blow it down. The whispers began then, hushed, poisonous, irretrievable. Words like fraud, liar, finished, slipped from table to table. The city's elite fed on scandal the way sharks fed on blood. Hannah Sterling, who once wielded fear as her crown, now found herself the entertainment, the punchline, the woman stripped bare. She stumbled, her silver gown dragging like chains, and fled the restaurant. Cameras followed, flashes bursting. Each photograph etched her downfall into the record. The queen was dead. Callista didn't move. Her body trembled only when the room's energy shifted from shock to murmurs, from theater back to supper. Mr. Dubois appeared at her side, his voice a whisper of disbelief. You should go. Now. Before the reporters." Samuel was waiting near the staff doors, his face pale but his eyes bright with awe. He handed her a glass of water. His voice was quiet, reverent. "You did it, kid." "You really did it." Callista sipped, her throat dry as ash. Her reflection in the glass showed a girl still wearing a waitress's uniform. But she no longer felt like one. She felt like someone who had wrestled with shadows and come out into the light. She changed in silence, folding her apron, tucking her mother sparrow pin back against her chest. Her hands shook, not with fear, but with release. When she stepped into the cool New York night, the city roared, as it always had, horns, voices, sirens. But for Callista, the air felt lighter. Hannah Sterling's empire had cracked, and with it, the weight that had hung over her family for years. The gala's chandeliers threw their honey-colored light over a room no longer sure whether to applaud or flee. Moments ago, Aurelia's Starlight Gala had been a pageant of satin gowns, imported orchids, and the hush of powers exchanging hands across white linen. Now the silence was jagged, punctured by gasps and the crackle of camera flashes. Hannah Sterling stood at the epicenter, one trembling hand still pressed to the neckline of her silver gown where the infamous sterling diamond lay hidden, a prop in a play that had collapsed around her. She had staged the accusation with all the skill of a Broadway actress. Tears cued, voice trembling in just the right pitch of panic, gaze sharpened to a blade as she pointed at the waitress. But the script had turned to ash the moment Callista Martinez spoke, not in tears or excuses, but in calm, merciless truth. Now Hannah's breath came ragged, shallow, like a fish gasping on a dock. She turned toward Robert, eyes wide, desperate for the thunder she had relied on all her life. She had been the lightning strike, terrifying, precise, but Robert had always been the storm that followed, clearing the field of any survivors. But Robert did not move. The great man of glass and steel, builder of towers and destroyer of neighborhoods, stood with arms crossed, jaw tight as granite. His gaze swept over his wife, over the hand clutching at the neckline where the diamond still glinted faintly, and his expression calcified into something colder than anger. It was dismissal, pure and surgical. He gave the barest shake of his head, a small, imperceptible flick to anyone beyond a few feet, but to Hannah it landed like a guillotine blade. It said, "You are finished. You are no longer useful. You are dead weight, and I do not carry the dead." Her lips parted as if to speak, to beg, but the words stuck. Robert turned sharply, motioning for his security detail. They fell into step around him like black-suited hounds. Without looking back, he strode toward the exit. The sound of his shoes on the polished marble floor was a metronome marking the end of her reign. Hannah's knees buckled. For years, she had been an empress in silk, her gaze enough to reduce grown men to children, her whispers able to sink reputations in a night. Now she was a spectacle. Her audience did not fear her. They consumed her, eyes gleaming with the hunger of vultures circling a carcass. The photographers who had been shooed into corners earlier now surged forward, emboldened. A bulb popped, freezing her expression. A woman half-draped in silver, half-stripped of power, caught between fury and terror. Another flash went off, and another, until the air felt like a thunderstorm of light. "Mrs. Sterling! Hannah, did you fake the theft? Is it true you lied in court years ago? Did Robert leave you?" The question flew like arrows. She raised her arms, instinctively trying to shield her face, but the cameras caught everything. The smudge of panic at her hairline, the crack in her lipstick smile, the desperate quiver of her hand. She staggered backward, bumping into a chair, the silver fabric of her gown catching on its carved armrest. For a woman who once orchestrated every detail down to the temperature of her martini glass, the sight was unbearable, clumsy, awkward, human. The guests were no longer pretending to look away. They watched with naked fascination, murmurs rippling through the glittering sea of gowns and tuxedos. These were not ordinary men and women. They were senators, heirs to dynasties, billionaires whose fortunes could swallow small nations. Yet all of them were united in a single forbidden pleasure, witnessing the downfall of one of their own. At the back of the room, Mr. Dubois wrung his hands so tightly the knuckles shone white. The manager's nightmare had not just come true, It had staged itself under his roof, his chandeliers, his watch. He whispered prayers under his breath to gods he hadn't believed in since boyhood in Lyon, begging them to spare Aurelia's reputation from the contagion of scandal. Meanwhile, Samuel, the grizzled waiter, stood frozen by the side wall, his silver tray tilting slightly in his grip. He had served under tyrants, had seen chefs throw pots and patrons belittle busboys. But nothing in 30 years of service had prepared him for the spectacle of Hannah Sterling stripped bare in front of the very people who once trembled before her. His weary eyes found Callista across the room. She stood still, her apron immaculate, her face pale but steady. Samuel gave the faintest nod, something like a salute. Callista herself felt hollow. The words she had spoken, about her father's bookstore, about Hannah's past, still rang in her ears like a church bell tolling long after the hammer had struck. She had not planned this, not entirely. She had prepared herself with facts, with history dug up in the quiet of her small apartment. But the choice to speak them aloud had been forged in the crucible of Hannah's cruelty. Now it was done, the truth was free, and she was standing in the aftermath of an earthquake she had unleashed. Hannah's collapse deepened. She clutched the diamond necklace now, too late, as though it could anchor her in a sea suddenly storming against her. She turned in circles, seeking an ally, a familiar smile, some voice to assure her this could still be salvaged. But the faces that met her gaze were masks of disgust, pity, or worse, curiosity. The queen bee was now an insect pinned to a board, studied by the very courtiers who once fed on her nectar. The two society wives at her table, women who had laughed at her jokes just an hour before, shifted their chairs subtly away from her. One whispered something to the other behind a manicured hand, and both tittered with cruel delight. A single thought pounded in Hannah's head, louder than the paparazzi, louder than the murmurs. This cannot be happening to me. She tried to lift her chin, to summon the imperious composure that had been her armor, but her body betrayed her. Her shoulders hunched, her voice cracked. When she finally spoke, it was not the razor-edged command of Aurelia's queen, but the shrill, uneven protest of a cornered woman. "Stop it! Stop taking pictures! This is slander! It's all lies! Robert, tell them!" But Robert was gone. The doors had already closed behind him. Her voice echoed in the cavernous room, met with no response but the mechanical staccato of camera shutters and the rustle of gossip. For the first time in her life, Hannah Sterling was alone. She stumbled toward the exit, the gown sequins catching and throwing light like broken glass. The hush parted before her, not out of reverence, but revulsion. No one offered her an arm. No one opened the door for her. She was a relic walking to her own funeral march. The final indignity came as she reached the threshold. A waiter, young and trembling, accidentally brushed against her with a tray of empty flutes. One glass slipped, fell, and shattered against the marble. The sharp crack echoed like a pistol shot, and the room erupted into laughter, low, cruel, but laughter all the same. Hannah froze, her face pale as ash. Then, without another word, she pushed through the doors and vanished into the night, chased by the snapping flashes of the paparazzi. The great Hannah Sterling, once untouchable, had fled, and in her wake, the room exhaled. Guests leaned into each other, voices rising, a carnival of speculation already swelling. The aura of fear that had once made them whisper in corners was gone, replaced by a giddy, reckless freedom. If she could fall, anyone could. Callista slipped away into the shadows of the service corridor, her breath ragged. She had no appetite for triumph. Victory felt heavy, almost unbearable. Yet beneath the weight was something else, a quiet release, as if chains she hadn't known she carried had fallen away. In the staff room, Samuel found her sitting on a wooden bench, hands clasped so tightly her knuckles ached. He sat beside her in silence. The fluorescent light buzzed overhead, washing them in a pale glow. Finally, he said, "You didn't just stand up to her. You ended her." Callista shook her head. "I didn't end her. She ended herself. I just held up the mirror." Morning in Manhattan usually carried its own rhythm. Horns bleeding down Fifth Avenue, the metallic grind of subway brakes, steam lifting from manholes, like the city was forever boiling. But the morning after the Starlight Gala, the city woke with an extra tremor, a vibration running through the pages of every newspaper and the glow of every phone screen. Hannah Sterling's face, ashen, horrified, clutching the infamous diamond she'd claimed was stolen, was everywhere. The tabloids screamed with headlines thick enough to choke on "Queen of Cruelty Caught in Her Own Web," "Sterling Scandal from Society's Darling to Public Disgrace," "The Fall of Hannah." Even the more respectable papers couldn't resist the feast. The Times ran a front-page analysis, how Hannah Sterling's humiliation signals a shift in the city's power dynamics. The Wall Street Journal noted the immediate dip in Sterling Properties' stock value, quietly musing whether Robert might restructure his domestic arrangements as ruthlessly as his business ones. And Aurelia, once whispered about as a temple of the elite, was dragged along for the ride. The restaurant's name trended on social media for the first time in its careful, insulated history. Not for its truffle risotto, but for being the stage of the downfall. Mr. Dubois fielded calls until his throat went raw, assuring every journalist that Aurelia's standards were unchanged, that the incident was purely personal. It didn't matter. The image was etched in the city's collective mind. Hannah Sterling, undone beneath Aurelia's chandeliers. Hannah herself did not emerge from her penthouse for days. The black Bentley that once ferried her to Aurelia and charity luncheons sat idle in the underground garage. Curtains remained drawn. Rumors circulated that she'd flown to Europe, that she'd checked into a private clinic upstate, that she was plotting some audacious counterstrike. The truth was less glamorous. Hannah sat in the half-dark of her gilded living room, still in the silver gown from that night, the sequins dulled by crushed wrinkles. Empty crystal glasses littered the coffee table, their rims stained with lipstick that had long since bled into the cracks of her once immaculate mouth. The sterling diamond, returned to its velvet case, lay discarded on the rug. It no longer glittered with triumph. It mocked her with its weight. Her phone buzzed, but she couldn't answer. Former friends left clipped voicemails, their tones frosted with polite distance. "Hannah, just checking in. Such an unfortunate misunderstanding." Others didn't bother with courtesy. "You've humiliated us all." "Don't call." She scrolled through gossip columns until her eyes burned. Each word was another knife. Once, fear had been her currency. Now pity was her brand, and pity was worse than hatred. Robert returned home only once in those days, long enough to inform her, without looking at her, that the divorce papers were being drawn up. "This is about survival," he said, pouring himself a drink without offering her one. "Sterling Properties cannot be dragged under by your melodrama." "Melodrama?" Her voice cracked. "Do you know what I've done for you? Do you remember who I was before? He cut her off with a glance flat and surgical. Irrelevant. The market doesn't remember. Neither do I. The door clicked shut behind him, and Hannah realized she had become invisible to the one man she had remade herself for. Callista, meanwhile, returned to her small Brooklyn apartment the night of the gala and collapsed on her futon. She slept for nearly 20 hours, her body finally claiming the rest it had been denied through weeks of dread. When she woke, sunlight poured through the cracked blinds, and the city hummed outside. She brewed coffee in a chipped French press and sat cross-legged on the floor, sketchbook in her lap. For the first time in years, her pencil moved without hesitation. She drew Hannah, not the queenly figure in silver, but the younger woman she had glimpsed through old clippings. Hannah Gallo, the frightened accountant who had traded truth for survival. She drew Robert, too, not as a titan of glass and steel, but as a man clutching at power so tightly his knuckles bled. She drew Aurelia's dining room, its chandeliers now hanging like tired sentinels over a battlefield. And then, slowly, she drew her father's bookstore, the sagging shelves, the worn leather chairs, the ghost of his smile in the doorway. For the first time since its destruction, she did not cry as she drew it. News reached her, of course. Samuel brought clippings, shaking his head in disbelief. "You did it?" he said quietly. "You toppled her." Callista shook her head. She toppled herself. "I just refused to kneel." Dubois called once, begging her to return to Aurelia. "We need you," he pleaded. "Your presence would reassure the patrons." But Callista declined. "I'm not invisible anymore, Mr. Dubois," she said softly. "And I don't want to serve at tables where I'm not seen." Instead, she picked up shifts at a small coffee shop in Williamsburg, where the air smelled of burnt espresso and cinnamon, and no one wore gowns worth more than a year's tuition. The tips weren't as legendary, but the laughter was real. She painted at night, canvases filling every spare inch of her walls. The city moved quickly, as it always did, but Hannah's name lingered like smoke after a fire. She tried to make appearances, tried to host luncheons again, but the invitations dwindled. Once, women had fought to sit at her table. Now they avoided her like she was contagious. Her last attempt at reclaiming her throne was a charity gala she hosted 6 months later at a smaller venue. Only a handful of loyalists came, and even they spent the evening glancing nervously at the door, as though afraid of being seen in her company. When the press covered it at all, it was with mockery. The uncrowned queen of Aurelia had been deposed, and no one wanted to rebuild her throne. Callista's path bent in the opposite direction. A modest gallery in Brooklyn hosted her first exhibition, titled Foundations. The centerpiece painting was a towering canvas of a silver-clad woman fractured into shards of mirror, each shard reflecting pieces of the lives crushed beneath Sterling Tower. Critics came. They wrote of her incisive vision, her ability to capture the quiet violence of power. For Callista, the praise mattered less than the faces of the people who came. Students, neighbors, strangers who lingered before her work and walked away with wet eyes. Samuel attended, his tie crooked, his shoes polished for the occasion. He stood before the portrait of Hannah Sterling and muttered, "She'd hate this." Then he smiled for the first time in years. And Aurelia? The restaurant survived, though never quite the same. Patrons still came for the white truffle and the hushed service. But something essential had shifted. The fear that once ran like electricity through its walls had bled away. It was no longer Hannah's court. It was just a restaurant. Dubois, weary but relieved, confided to Samuel one night, "Perhaps it's better this way. Less terror, more food." Samuel raised his glass. To fewer queens. Hannah Sterling lived on, of course. She still had money, property, the husk of her old life. But stripped of fear, her name no longer commanded. She became a cautionary tale whispered in penthouses and boardrooms. Remember Hannah. Don't believe you're untouchable. And Callista? She carried her father's bookstore not in bitterness anymore, but in her brushstrokes. Each painting was a reclamation, each canvas a brick in the foundation of a life built not on cruelty, but on dignity. She never saw Hannah again. She didn't need to. Some battles are won not by returning to the battlefield, but by walking away and building something better. As winter settled over the city, Callista stood at her gallery's window one night, watching the snow catch in the streetlights. She thought of Aurelia's chandeliers, of Hannah's mask cracking, of her father's hands arranging books in the shop window. She whispered to herself, not as a vow, but as a truth, fear is fragile, dignity endures. And with that, she turned back to her easel, where a new canvas waited, blank and bright, ready for whatever story she would tell next. New York never paused for long. The cabs still howled down Madison, steam still curled out of subway grates, and the neon in Times Square kept blinking as if nothing in the world had changed. But in its private corners, where deals were signed over Bordeaux and reputations weighed like gold, the name Hannah Sterling had shifted from thunderbolt to cautionary tale. 6 months after the Starlight Gala, Aurelia's chandeliers shone with their usual amber glow, but the electricity was gone. Patrons still ordered the truffle risotto, still nodded at the sommelier with faint condescension, but the old hush of fear had drained out of the air. Where once a whisper from Hannah could ruin a career, now her absence was just a gap, like a chair left vacant at a long table. Mr. Dubois kept smoothing his tie, though no one threatened to unravel his livelihood with a raised eyebrow anymore. He sometimes caught himself glancing at the corner booth where Hannah had ruled, expecting her Bentley's shadow to return. It never did. The staff had stopped flinching at the sound of polished heels. Life in Aurelia had become impossibly, wonderfully ordinary. Robert Sterling adapted quickly, as men like him always did. Within weeks of the gala, he had filed for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences, though everyone knew what the differences were. He shed Hannah the way he shed underperforming assets, quietly, efficiently, without ceremony. The papers speculated about his next wife, his next tower, his next conquest. Sir Robert understood what Hannah never did. In a city that worships power, survival means movement. Standing still is death. And Hannah? She lingered in exile, not the geographical kind, but the social one, every bit as brutal. She still lived in her penthouse overlooking Central Park, still wore silk that cost as much as a semester's tuition, still drank champagne colder than ice. But none of it mattered without an audience. Friends stopped returning calls. Invitations dried up. When she appeared at charity luncheons, cameras still turned, but only to capture the novelty of a fallen queen. The captions were merciless. Once feared, now forgotten. Her voice, once an instrument of quiet devastation, grew thin. At home she spoke to mirrors, rehearsing lines no one would hear again. On the rare nights she braved a restaurant, the staff treated her with mechanical courtesy, polite, distant, untouched by fear. She had built her throne on intimidation, and once that currency ran out, she discovered she had nothing left. Calista Martinez, meanwhile, carried no crown, no fortune, no Bentley. Yet her world widened. The gallery show in Brooklyn had been modest. White walls, a scattering of critics, the faint smell of paint thinner still clinging to the corners. But it was hers. Her canvases spoke with the clarity she had never found waiting tables. Fractured portraits of power, shadows of glass towers looming over small figures, blossoms of light where dignity refused to die. One painting in particular drew the crowd, The Price of a Tower. It showed a woman in a gown of shattered silver, her eyes reflecting both the terrified girl she once had been and the ruthless queen she became. Behind her rose the ghostly image of a bookstore, its windows glowing faintly against the steel. Viewers stood before it for long minutes, whispering, some shaking their heads, some wiping their eyes. Calista did not linger by the canvas. She drifted through the room, offering wine, answering questions in her quiet way. But when she saw a young woman, another student, she guessed, standing transfixed before the painting, Calista felt something shift. The girl wasn't just looking at art. She was recognizing herself, her own battles, her own dignity. That recognition was worth more than any review in the Times. Samuel came, of course. His jacket smelled faintly of starch, his tie knotted too tightly, his eyes tired but soft. He stood before The Price of a Tower, clearing his throat once, twice, as though words had gotten stuck. Then he simply said, "You gave her the ending she deserved." Calista shook her head. "No, I gave myself the ending I needed. Seasons changed." By winter, Hannah had vanished almost entirely from public life. Rumors said she spent her days in Europe, drifting between spas and villas. But New York no longer cared. The city had already crowned new queens, new villains. Memory is short when gossip is endless. But sometimes, in the quiet of Aurelia's kitchen, staff still whispered about the night. The chandelier light caught the sterling diamond hidden in Hannah's gown, about the waitress who spoke truth in a room full of liars. They told it like a legend, a reminder that fear could be broken. Calista never returned to Aurelia. She didn't need to. The restaurant was a stage she had exited, and the city had given her a new one. She painted, she taught workshops at the Pratt Institute. She lived in an apartment still small, but now filled with canvases and light. Some nights she walked across the Brooklyn Bridge and looked at the skyline, the towers piercing the dark like needles. She always found her gaze settling on Sterling Tower. It no longer looked invincible. It looked hollow, a monument built on bones. She would remember her father then, his bookstore smelling of dust and ink, his laugh carrying through the aisles. His death had left her with grief, but also with a spine of steel. She realized, standing there on the bridge, that she had carried him into that dining room the night of the gala. His dignity had stood with her. His memory had been her weapon. The lesson, if one could call it that, was simple but sharp. Hannah Sterling had believed that money could buy obedience, that fear could purchase immortality. She had been wrong. Dignity, quiet, stubborn, unpurchasable, had toppled her more completely than any rival could. Calista never set out to be a heroine. She never wanted a war. All she wanted was to keep her father's memory intact, to pay for her canvases, to find a place where she could belong. But sometimes history chooses its fighters, and when the moment came, she had not looked away. The city would forget Hannah eventually, but it would not forget the story of the waitress who stood up in Aurelia and refused to kneel. On a snowy night nearly a year later, Callista hung a new painting in her studio. It was simple, a candle burning in the dark, a single white flower beside it. The flame threw a soft glow, banishing the harsh shadows. It was a memory of a moment when she had shifted a vase just so, softened the light on a cruel woman's face, and proven to herself that even in small gestures there was power. She stepped back, wiped her hands, and smiled. Outside, New York roared and glittered as always. But inside that room, in the hush of paint and canvas, Callista understood something Hannah never had. Power is loud, but dignity, it endures in silence.